you get no more love. So we're going to talk today about confrontational coaching. The confrontations that sometimes happen in coaching. Is it okay that you confront your clients? Do you have permission to do that? What happens when you do that? Why should you do that? And when should you avoid confrontation in coaching as well? We're going to talk also a little bit about I think it was 4 or 5 months ago, what happened when Tony Robbins had a little bit of a confrontation in one of his seminars around the Me Too movement, and he got in trouble for that, and some of the aspects of confrontation that occurred in that interaction as well as a little bit of an example. So should you confront clients? How should you confront clients? Why should you confront clients? When does it make sense to do that? When does it not make sense to do that as well? Hey Kimberly, hey John, hey Susan, great to have you here. So where to start? So I'm actually gonna start just by sharing a coaching session that I had just a couple, 2 weeks ago, something like that. And I was talking to, or I was working with a coach that is in our Synergy Private Client program. And she brought up that she is coaching a client right now that just is all over the place. They're all over the map, as this kind of, our little picture indicates. Sorry about that. These guys are all about to fall over. It's live, ladies and gentlemen, so... Sorry about that. Anyway, you get the idea. So, here. See if we can't get these things to go straight. I don't have backboards for them, so they just have to cooperate. All right. Hopefully that helps. Is that staying? I just won't touch it. Okay. So anyway, her client was all over the place, meaning that she couldn't pin them down. She couldn't seem to get them to focus on one thing at a time. She couldn't even get them to share the result or the goal that they had in that session. By the way, if you're about to go through accountability training with us starting tomorrow, if you're in Master Coach University and you're going through the accountability immersion training, this is really helpful to understand the aspects of confrontation that occur, especially when you're holding a client accountable. It's one of the areas in coaching that tends to create confrontation as well. So if you're just got into that immersion training, definitely you want to check this out. I'll probably share it with you later. So anyway, this coach that I'm working with asked, well, how do I rein this client in? How do I rein in the rambling client? And I asked her, so, well, what do you do? What do you do with this client? And she said, well, I ask her what their goals are, and they kind of just ramble along. They don't really stay on one subject, and they never really tell me the answer. And I said, well, what do you do when they do that? And she says, well, I try to pin them down. I try to ask them another question. And then they just keep rambling. They don't really respond. They're not really listening to me, and they're not answering the question that I'm asking them. They're just all over the place. And so I said, well, what do you think you need to do about that? Now that I know what you're doing, what should you do? And she said, well, I think what I need to do is I didn't need to be really blunt with them. I need to let them know, hey, you know what? If you're going to get something from this session, you need to stick to one subject. You need to decide what your goal is. You need to respond and answer my questions, or else this is going to be a waste of your time. This isn't going to work for us. This isn't going to make a difference for you. And so I thought, that sounds great. So I asked her, why didn't you bring that up in the session? Why didn't you say that? Why didn't you confront that client? And she said, well, I didn't want to be confrontational. I just didn't want to be pushy. I wanted to support my client. And I thought, you know what? This is a common barrier for coaches. They want to be their client's best friend. They want to be nice. They want to have a harmonious relationship with their clients. And there's nothing wrong with that desire. that's a great thing. In fact, today we're going to talk a little bit about why that actually helps when you do ultimately confront a client, depending on how you do it. But the breakthroughs in a session or the breakthroughs in a coaching relationship a lot of times come from the coach or the client communicating what they can't say. So I'll say that again. The breakthroughs that come within your coaching relationship occur when you say something that you can't say. You say what couldn't be said before. That is, you can think of that as a confrontation. So, that the coach that I was working with, again, she said, well, I just feel like I'm beating my head against the wall with this client. And I try this, I try that, and I'm just beating my head in the same brick wall over and over and over again. And I said, wait a second, it's their life. Like, you're just the coach. You're on the sideline. You're not in the game. It's their problem that they're coping with and that they're dealing with. So, why are you the one beating your head against the wall? Why are you taking on the pain that, frankly, your client probably should be going through if they actually care enough about their situation, and what they say they want from these conversations is actually what they want, other than just getting a chance to talk to somebody. And so when a coach is beating their head against the wall with a client, I think that something's wrong here, because you need to make sure that the beating against the wall and the grinding away and the angst that's happening, that doesn't belong in you as the coach. As a coach, your job is not to take on the pain and the suffering of your clients. You couldn't survive if you're coaching enough people. You're not going to survive emotionally, if not physically, doing that on a regular basis. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't mean you can't empathize. It doesn't mean you don't care. It just means that you're not going to say, oh, well, things aren't going well, so it really hurts me that they're not going well. That's not a great outcome. And it definitely doesn't help rein in a rambling client. So if you're dealing with that, you're beating your head against the wall with a client, you got to stop taking the problems that your client has you got to stop taking them inside of yourself. You got to put those problems where they belong. You got to put that angst where it belongs. You got to put the suffering where it belongs, in your client. It doesn't mean that you want your client to suffer. It doesn't mean that you enjoy that. That's not the point. But it means that it's your client's life, and you leave the life with your client, not taking it on for yourself. That doesn't help your client to do that, generally speaking. There might be times where that level of empathy, that level of feeling what the client is feeling, could be very helpful. But if you're so stuck because you're taking on their feelings, if you're so emotionally driven by how they feel, then you can't help your client from that space, because that's probably one of the reasons why they're stuck. They're stuck because they're dealing with those same emotions, or they're suppressing them, for that matter. Maybe part of your job might actually be to help them bring out what's truly going on, what they really are feeling. If they're suffering, why are they not acting like it? Why aren't they admitting the suffering that they have? So this made me realize that so many coaches are not confronting their clients. So many coaches have a need to gain a certain amount of facility with confrontation, because that's part of what causes results to happen with a client, is at some point there needs to be a confrontation. So this brings me back 6 months. I really wanted to share this and discuss this 6 months ago when this actually came up. And this isn't the greatest quality picture, but this is a representation of what happened at a recent Unleash the Power Within seminar that Tony Robbins teaches on a regular basis around the world. And he was discussing, some might say complaining, about the Me Too movement. Probably not a good political move on Tony's part. But Tony doesn't exactly edit what he thinks. His opinions are kind of on loudspeaker. That's just probably part of what makes him effective at other times. So he was saying things like, Me Too, the movement, it's endorsing victimhood. It's that CEOs are avoiding hiring women now because they're afraid of what might happen if they do, because of this Me Too movement. They're afraid that they're going to get in trouble and things are going to go to hell in their business because they hired a woman, basically, even if she's more qualified than the man. He paraphrasing said that this is basically destroying good people's lives, right? And again, I don't want to get into exactly what was said, but you get the idea. This is not a discussion around whether he was right or wrong. I don't really want to bring up that subject completely, but a woman stood up and she confronted him. And this is actually just a picture of her doing that right here. And she said, you don't understand the Me Too movement. You're not appreciating what it means to us. You're mischaracterizing and misconstruing what this is really about. And I think you really need to apologize for that. I think you really need to correct yourself. She's saying this to Tony at his seminar in front of like 3,000 people, something like that, right? She's a bit nervous doing this, but she's, courageous enough to do it, which is great. And so he said, when you go on the attack, and he actually did this is actually a picture of a little exercise. He did this little fist pushing exercise, and the point he was making was, when you attack somebody, they're going to defend. So if you're going to attack men are going to defend themselves. They're probably going to push back, they're going to attack back. And so the way that he demonstrated this was kind of a physical metaphor at the time. So he said, okay, come here, and he said, put your fist out, and she puts her fist out, and then he puts his fist against her fist, and he says, I want you to hold your fist up, and I'm going to push your fist. I'm not telling you to push back. I'm not saying push back. I'm just going to push your fist. And so he kept pushing her fist, and she like step back, step back, step back, and he kept pushing her, basically. And he was trying to make a point that, okay, when you push, people just resist. People push back. So force is met with equal and opposite force, basically. Relativity, right? But when he, and that was his point, when all you do is attack, people are going to defend. And what's funny about this is, like, we're talking about confrontation in coaching as a positive thing. We're saying, well, hey, if you confront your client, then that could be good. That could actually help the coaching relationship. That could cause a real breakthrough with your client. It totally can. So why is Tony saying, when you confront, i.e. use force and push, that all you get is a war? All you get is people defending themselves? It seems a little confusing. At the same time, though, the reaction to him doing this little demonstration at his seminar was, Tony is a misogynist. Tony hates all women. How dare he talk over that woman? I mean, he was interrupting. Tony tends to do that a good deal. He's kind of a dominant guy. And then he did this little exercise, and so people were like, how dare he use his physical size? I mean, he's like 3 feet taller than this woman, right? They're like, how dare he use his physical size to intimidate this woman? He's attacking us. Like, these are the kind of things that people said over and over and over again. And, I kind of reacted to this and on some of those comments, and I said things like, it's a little petty. I mean, he's doing a demonstration. This woman signed up for his seminar. She's requesting his coaching. This is part of in fact, his style of what he did in this particular demonstration is actually pretty tame compared to what Tony normally does when he actually confronts somebody. So, and of course I didn't get great responses to that. As you can imagine, people were pretty upset. They were saying, you're gaslighting, and Tony's trying to hurt people, and he should know better than to confront this poor woman who can't defend herself, and just it's kind of ridiculous, kind of petty in my opinion. And one of my clients actually said, hey, look, I'd like to respond to this, but I'm afraid to do it on your comments. I'd like to direct message you. I'm going to tell you what I think. So I said, great, direct message me. And she shared her opinion. I'm not going to share it here. But I said, hey, I encourage you to share that live, and I'll respond to it. But I think it was a heartfelt response. And so she did, and I responded to it. And this is what my response was, just to give you a sense of kind of where I came out on this confrontation. and again, it's weird and it's kind of meta that Tony would say when you push somebody, they push back, and all you're creating is defensiveness, and you're creating a war. When he's actually confronting somebody at the same moment, and actually, in my opinion, I don't even really think he was coaching at this time, but because he just didn't go that deep. It was more of a kind of a discussion or an argument more than anything, kind of a little bit of a mini debate during the seminar. So I think he was just doing this as a demonstration to make a point. But anyway, this is my response to that, among others. Tony didn't seem to appreciate the value that Me Too has brought to people, and it's because I thought that some of the things that he said were probably a little off base, maybe a lot off base. A lot of people that I've talked to that were at the event said Tony was blathering in a way that just was out of context and it didn't make sense, and he probably should have shut up about it, basically. These are people that really love Tony's work as well. So, I got that, he probably was a little off base here. But I said, also, and I'm just reading this, it's quite immature to expect Tony to just hand over his seminar to a woman who is respectfully attacking him, derailing the seminar, and focusing on critiquing him versus working on herself. So this is his seminar, right? She's there to work on her, not necessarily to position a movement. Nothing wrong with doing that. Like, she can do that, but don't expect somebody to hand the reins over to you and not confront you or not argue or not attempt to coach you at that time. It's like, what were you thinking, right? And the fact that he's 1.5 feet taller than her is really irrelevant at this point. Now, you could say, well, and this is what some people argued at this point. A lot of people said, well, the fact that he's bigger means he can't touch her. He can't do a physical demonstration with her because that's too intimidating, right? And I thought, wow, that's really assuming a lot about how weak this woman is. In fact, afterwards, this gal went on lots of interviews and she said how much she liked Tony. She said how she was really okay. She was a little nervous because of the crowd, but I don't remember her saying anything like, I was so intimidated by this guy and I was being abused or something like that. It just wasn't the case. And again, is it possible that somebody could be intimidated in this situation? Totally possible, right? But that's between them. And again, it's her responsibility to participate in the seminar or not. She stood up, decided to get on the firing line. I'm just like, hey, your request for coaching about this, if you have a problem with the form through which the coaching comes, that's not really like Tony's problem. It's his program. That was part of the point that I'm making there in a paraphrase. So then I went on to say, and I'm just read this again, he was pretty nice to her compared to how intense Tony gets in many other interactions in his seminars. He didn't silence her. He actually let her go on and on way longer than is appropriate for that forum and the intention of those interactions. The intention of these interactions was not to make a political point. It wasn't even to make a point about abuse or about the movement or anything like that. To be fair, he was making some of his points, and so he kind of opened the door for people to, make their arguments. That was totally fine. But again, that Tony's going to argue back, and that's basically what he did. So I just finalized this by saying it's his seminar. He built it. He worked for it. She gets to speak with his permission in that environment. That is totally appropriate. It's like it's up to him whether or not she gets to talk, or she gets to share, or she gets to stand up and be heard. That's that. Now, it's polite to do that. It's great that he did that, but he gets to measure how much of that he shares in his own environment, not the other way around. So that's the point I made. And again, this is a little sideline compared to what we're supposed to be talking about today, but this was a confrontation and people reacted to it. And again, who cares how they react? What really matters is what happened between them. And again, my point with this was this, in my opinion, based on everything I've seen with Tony, is that he wasn't really coaching her there. If he had been coaching her, it wasn't the greatest interaction. I'll totally admit that. It definitely wasn't the greatest in terms of showing the truth about that movement, I think, as well, even between both of them. But the confrontation was his way of demonstrating certain things and getting people to think. And a lot of people didn't just react to this experience. a lot of people also really thought about it, really thought about what are the ramifications of the different things that people do within this movement. What's the impact of all this? How do people really feel about it? What are the long-term implications, not just what's happening in the moment, right? Got people to think a little bit more deeply than just what's on the surface of that conversation. I don't know that that's really a bad thing. I mean, if you think it is, or it was, if you have a perspective on this, you know what to do. You can always comment on any of these forums that we have, except it'll be hard for me to see on Instagram because I've got such a small device there. So anyway, this is something that came up that just demonstrated to me how much reaction can happen from confrontation, and also how many people misjudge or judge confrontation when it comes up in even a coaching environment. So let's talk about why confrontation is okay or why it's not okay. So when people make excuses, or the client is really, your client you're working with is just getting stopped for no reason, or they're not taking any action, and they're really falling off a cliff in terms of their own participation in even the coaching relationship. It's totally appropriate to confront your client. In fact, it's part of your responsibility to confront your client, in my opinion. And if you don't, you are actually shortchanging your client. You are you're not truly serving that coaching relationship. Part of your job as a coach is to drive the progress that's happening in a coaching session. And your client sometimes, frankly, is going to be the opposite of that. They're not going to drive the progress in that coaching session. You're supposed to be doing that. Now, it's great if your client does that, but they're paying you to make sure that somebody's totally responsible for driving the progress in that session. And sometimes that's just going to have to be the coach. Now, so if your client's getting stopped, or they're taking no action, or they're making excuses, or they're just irresponsible, confront them. You need to confront them. You may not do a perfect job, but those are some really important reasons why you should confront your client when it's time to do that. Now, sometimes confronting just starts a war. I see this a lot, and especially if anybody who's going through accountability training starting tomorrow with us, I do see this. I encourage our coaches to confront when it's appropriate, when it makes sense, just like we talked about. And then they'll come back to me and saying, I confronted my client, and then they just started attacking me, and they yelled at me, and they told me I was a horrible coach, and blah, 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 blah. That can happen, right? So sometimes that's what happens is confrontation just starts a war. And why? Like, when does that happen? Well, first of all, obviously you can do this in a way that is not that's not very well done. Okay, you just you might be lousy at confrontation at this point, right? I'd rather you do it than not, because the more you do it, even if you do it and it starts a war and things don't go well, you can repair that, number one. And number two, you're going to get better at it, because if that was painful for you, which it probably was, then you're going to think, how could I have done that better? Now, some coaches, unfortunately, get the message, I'm just never going to confront again. No more confrontation for me, right? And that's unfortunate. But if you learn the lessons of the finer points of the confrontational process and how you can do it more elegantly and in a way that actually gets a positive response from a client and yourself, then great. You don't have to do it perfect right off the bat. Okay. Hey, Meryl, good to see you. Oh, hey, Kelly. Just noticed you came on. So, all right. So moving on. Well, actually, let's stay on this subject for a second. So when does a war show up when you confront? Well, number one, bad timing. Sometimes this is not the time to confront your client. When I'm working with a new client, for instance, I probably try to avoid like a major confrontation with that client for the first couple months of working together, because I want to lay a foundation of really a supportive relationship where they're truly safe and honored. In fact, when I'm in coaching relationships where the commitment is questionable, at least, and I actually confront a client within those first couple months, it can really shake the foundation of that relationship from what I've seen. Now you could say, well, that client was just not committed in the first place, and okay, fine. But part of who we are as coaches is facilitators of confrontation, or sorry, thinking about confrontation, facilitators of commitment. And so if our client isn't committed today, like we can actually facilitate them getting committed. And maybe the best way to do that is not just to attack a client, right? It's like all of a sudden confront them right off the bat. It might not be the best thing to do. So bad timing, that's a great example of bad timing is as soon as you start working together, just confront. Some clients or some new clients, that's exactly what you need to do. There are certain types of individuals where if you don't confront them up front, they won't respect you or they won't think that you're going to add value to them, right? But it's a good example of bad timing when you do it maybe a little earlier than you need to or than you should with that particular client. Hey Marilyn, good to see you. So attitude is another issue. Sometimes when a coach confronts the client, they do it with such attitude. They do it. They're righteous. They're holier than thou. They're making their client wrong. They're doing all these things that just the attitude sucks. By the way, on the other side, if your client's attitude is lousy at the moment you confront them, and I don't mean just a bad attitude, let's say, but an attitude whereas they're feeling superior to you, well, if you confront them when they're feeling superior to you, it's like, how dare you say that? You're just here to serve me, right? So depending on the attitude that you have about that confrontation and depending on the attitude that your client has at that time, it might not be a good idea to even try to confront at that moment. You might want to put that off till later. Bad timing, bad attitude. And the third one is that if there's no respect or the client doesn't see that you have any authority in that relationship, which hopefully that's not the case at that point, but it's possible. If that's the case, confronting your client in many circumstances will just disconnect that relationship. It may not be a good idea, and it may just start a war. Now, there are ways to unravel a war. There's ways to backpedal if a war begins. You can retreat in a battle, and there's ways to do that. And I don't want to get into the technicalities of that right now. And there are times when the war just keeps going and you have trouble backpedaling out of it. But even if this happens, it's not the end of the world. And also, you want to be strategic about when you may actually confront your client. And if you think a war is going to erupt just because you confront them, maybe you want to avoid that for the moment. So I just had a comment come through on Instagram here. Yeah, you need rapport at a minimum. Yeah, you got it. Now, by the way, rapport sometimes means a fight, right? Because rapport can mean people respond to you. And sometimes when somebody responds in a negative way, that's rapport too. You're having an impact on them. So rapport can be positive rapport, like I say something and you're like, oh, that feels really good to hear that, right? And rapport can also be kind of a negative thing, like I say something or do something and you're like, dick. That can happen too. Any rapport is better than no rapport. Like no rapport means they're not even listening, right? They're not even there. They're not even in that session with you. And of course, some coaches check out sometimes, and they're not even showing up. They're not even fully present, right, and aware, and with their client, and relating fully to their client. But just because you have rapport doesn't necessarily mean that you can avoid the war when you confront. So these are times when you may want to watch for that. By the way, it doesn't sometimes there might be a point where war is inevitable to some extent, and you just got to care enough about your client to say, I'm going to go through that and allow them to go through that as well. But I'm generalizing here. Generally speaking, we want to avoid a war with our client. That's not going to create a positive, ongoing coach-client relationship. Okay, so now let's talk about when it does make sense. Sometimes confronting is required. Sometimes it is a requirement to confront. Not something you can escape, not something your client can escape. It's something you just gotta do. Let's see. Mary says, what do you suggest for CTs who are, was that institutionalized? So that's a big one. That's a tall order. So it depends. I mean, it depends on how many drugs they're on, right? Because I mean, a lot of times somebody who is going through an addiction, it doesn't matter whether it's prescription or not. There can be psychoactive impacts, right? And so sometimes the confrontation, they won't even notice it then, or they'll react more to it, like if they're like coming off a certain medication, something like that. The point of this is not to try to give you a clinical direction on how to deal with a client who is, let's say somebody who is in a clinical relationship with you. That's outside the boundaries of the conversation I'm trying to create right here. But I would say that sometimes you might even coach somebody who clearly biochemically is affected by something, or they're in a situation where they've been diagnosed with something, and you got permission from their therapist or any medical professionals that are working with them that you can work with them. And I'll tell you, I mean, I've had a client before who's been in that situation, and I coached them, did the best I can. I was probably not confrontational enough. And months later, years later, I don't exactly remember when it was, but after he'd been done coaching with us, he actually committed suicide. And I thought about that, and I thought, was I a part of that in some way? But I also thought, did I not do enough? And if I could go back in time, I would have been much more intense with that client. Why? Because his life possibly depended on that. And so I would err on the side personally of confronting more and more intensely than not confronting enough. And again, timing and all those other things, are important to appreciate. But, I think the real problems are when you don't confront at a level you need to, and somebody can get by, and it's acceptable that somebody's putting themselves through something emotionally or physically that is simply unacceptable, that it's unsustainable. For that particular client that I worked with years ago, he was doing something, whether it was inside his head or outside. He had a family and something that he was up to that I probably even could see, just from my perspective, diagnosing and trying to understand him, that I probably didn't confront him with enough intensity. I wonder, if I had confronted him with the level of intensity that I feel I would now if I had it to do over, would he still be around? Would I have been able to actually make a bigger difference and an impact with that client that would have, would have been such an important piece, not just for him, but for his family and the people that he touched as well? I don't know. Ultimately, it was his responsibility to take his own life. But as his coach, it was my responsibility to do whatever it took, no matter how intense or how painful it was for me or for him in the moment, to turn things around. So I wonder, did I really do that? And my judgment personally, and again, this is just my judgment, is I didn't confront enough. So again, I can't say about, different people in different situations, institutions, etc. They're going to have, everybody's going to have a case-by-case difference in terms of how you address them, right? And that's where the art of coaching comes in. You can have some scientific, perfect diagnosis, this is exactly what's going on, this is what I need to share, etc. But depending on what's going on in that moment and what your sixth sense tells you, and what what the rapport level is, as our Instagram friend just mentioned, you might need to change how you operate. But I would rather be more intense, or what I think would be too intense, rather than not intense enough. Even if somebody seems a bit fragile, even if somebody seems like like people get diagnosed with stuff, and then all of a sudden everyone around them handles them with kid gloves. Everybody is like walking around on pins and needles, right? It's like, well, now this person's in this padded cell where the things that they used to do that actually were an issue for them, now there's no impact. It's like people are like, okay, that person's nuts, so just leave them alone. Just, let them do that. It's, so, and by the way, it doesn't mean that may not be a good approach for a moment, but to treat somebody that way forever, for ongoing periods of time, I don't know that that's really that helpful. It might be helpful for the people around them rather than that person. Reminds me of, I remember Richard Bandler, founder of NLP, once shared a story about a guy in an institution. I'm just brought up the word, so I'm triggered to think about it now. And they brought him in, and here's a guy that would walk around the that level of wherever he was in the institution. He would walk around the general area with the doctors and everything, and he would tell everybody that he was Jesus, right? He would walk around and say, "Hi, I'm Jesus Christ. I forgive you for your sins, and like you'll be saved through believing in me," and just like totally believed this. You could see like he was really committed to this experience that he had. You could call it something that's basically a hallucination, right? I don't know exactly what the technical term in the DSM-5 would be, but he was clearly, everybody seemed to feel he was a little nuts. So Richard came to him and he said, "Oh, are you Jesus?" And so he's playing along, right? He's not confronting him. He's just playing along at first. But this was temporary. Check this out. He said, "Are you Jesus?" And the guy says, "Yes, my son, I'm Jesus." And he said, "Oh, okay, good to know." And he walks away. Richard walks away, just completely breaks off communication with him. And then he comes back a little bit later, and he brings a tape measure. And he says, "Okay, so you are Jesus, correct? I just want to make sure I got this right. You're Jesus? You're really Jesus?" And he says, "Yes, my son, I'm Jesus." So he starts measuring his arms and measuring his height. And he's like, "Okay, all right." And he starts writing down all these measurements, right? And Jesus is sitting there like, "What are you doing? Like, what the heck is going on?" This is it's not like confrontational yet, but it's weird. It's like, this is not the way most people treat me, right? So and then Richard Bandler leaves again. He walks away. And he comes back a little bit later, and he's got wood, and he's got hammer and nails, and he starts nailing together these pieces of wood. And then he goes up to the guy. He says, "You are Jesus, correct?" And now this guy's like, "Yes, I'm Jesus." And he's starting to look a little nervous, right? He's like, "Okay, you need to come with me." And so like he's bringing him down the hall now, and he's like, he put together basically this cross, and acting like he's not saying anything, but he's just acting like he's going to crucify him, right? And then finally, right at the end of this experience, this guy who was a little nuts is like, wait, I was making it all up. I'm not Jesus. I swear to God, I'm not Jesus. And so he totally changed this guy's story. He totally changed his state of mind. He made it untenable. He made it painful for this guy to remain Jesus, right? Now that was, again, it was kind of an indirect confrontation. It was very creative on Richard's part, right? But he's like, most people have been tiptoeing around this guy, making it like, oh, this guy just says he's Jesus. We're just going to shut up and listen and just let him be. There's no impact now, especially now that he's been diagnosed. We got to be safe around him. We got to put him in a safe space, etc. Richard did the opposite of that. It was very jarring. How's that for a confrontation? It's like, oh, you're Jesus? Let's go crucify you, right? So not necessarily always the approach to take, but in this case, it worked. This guy radically changed his mindset about things just in that one. And again, obviously, there were, I'm sure, deeper seated reasons for why this guy made up that he was Jesus and created this whole kind of episode, that lasted, it seems, for years. But Richard was able to break through the surface issue through what you might call a required confrontation. Something is absolutely required. We got another comment on Instagram here. In management, in management we're talking about now. That's a whole different world. When do you know when you give up on an employee and moving forward to hire someone else? So, well, first thing is, and this happens like 9 times out of 10 when I talk to managers. The manager will say, this is a lousy employee I've got. They're not responding to my coaching. They're not taking my feedback. And I said, well, great. Are you clear about what you expect of them? And they're like, well, I think I am. And we talk through it, and then all of a sudden we find out that it wasn't that clear. And then even if they were clear, I say, okay, well, then when you were clear, did you set up a way of measuring their results? And are they aware that they're screwing up? Are they aware that they are not in line with what's expected? Have you shared that with them? Have you confronted them on that? And sometimes they'll say yes, and a lot of times I'll find that they really haven't, or they haven't done it with clarity, right? And then I finally ask, well, are you clear with your client or with that employee that there are consequences to this, that you're not going to continue to work with them if they can't straighten up, if they can't do their job well? A lot of times they're not clear on that. So it's like three different levels. Think of it this way, three different confrontations that in management is required. And this is just the manager doing their job, right? And each of those has got to be clear confrontations. It's like, hey, this is what you need to do. This is how it needs to be done. These are the measurements of success. Do you understand? And give it to them in writing in such a way where they can remember it and use it. And then the second confrontation is, okay, you didn't do it in this case. You need to do it differently. We already covered that. Are you clear? And being clear with that required confrontation. And that's probably like more than once, because if you just do it once, maybe they think you're not serious also. So there's a certain level of consistency in management that you got to maintain. As a coach, you could be much more intense for like a single time, but in management, you may need to be more consistent and do that multiple times. And then finally, it's like, okay, look, you've screwed this up 2 or 3 times. We're not going to be able to continue to work with you if this continues to happen. Do you understand that? Right? So they really get what the consequence is for not continuing to follow through. Most of the time, I'd say 9 times out of 10, it's hilarious, but this is the truth from what I've seen, 9 times out of 10, a manager is screwing up on one of those areas. And then we blame our employee. And it's like, it doesn't mean the employee's not also screwing up. Maybe they are, right? But if it's our business or if it's the office or the area that we're managing, then let's be the most responsible in that relationship and do the required confrontations. And look, if that person, like if you do that politely, if you do that in a way that's appropriate for the business environment, and they start a war with you, then great. At least you know this person's not a good fit for the organization that you have, right? But that's the minimum required. And again, I think in a business environment, maybe the intensity level is not, like, you don't want to be as intense because that's like a family. You're gonna live with that person for years and years and years. But a coach, that's what's nice about outsourcing some of your management to coaches. A coach can get in somebody's face and like, hey, you hate me. I don't know it. It's like, that's irrelevant, right? Because like, I'm just the coach. I'm a bit removed from that family to some extent. I can be really intense and you don't have to talk to me anymore, or don't have to talk to me that much. So I'd rather be the bad cop than the manager be somebody that has a irreconcilable relationship with that employee. However, I've also seen the opposite, like where I'll work with an organization and the manager is kind of they're more confrontational, right? They're more of a bad cop. And people will come to me as the coach and complain about them. And then I'm kind of end up being the good cop in a way. But the relationship that both of us have, manager and coach, it gives us a chance to where there's always a good relationship with at least one of us. And that when one person turns on the heat, the other can support that individual, that client, that employee, in getting over the bar. This happens all the time, and I think it's a more stable management and coaching relationship for employees than it is just to have only a coach or only a manager. I do know some organizations that they don't do any management and they outsource all their management to their to a coach that they'll hire, and I don't think that's phenomenal. It's better than nothing, but it's not the best way to approach it. So I love the comments, guys. I mean, we're covering a lot of different environments through which somebody might need coaching and you might need to confront. In a clinical environment, in a professional environment, coaching environment. We got to take these contexts into consideration, there's no doubt. But a lot of these rules, or not even rules, I don't even want to call it that, a lot of these spaces to stand and these understandings and these distinctions around confrontation are still ones that we want to consider and utilize as we work with our teams or with our patients or with our clients as coaches as well. So really great questions. All right, let's see, where was I? So we're talking about when it's required. So it's required when the client's asleep. If your client is sleeping and they're not awake, like they're not even really there with you, or they're like totally ignoring what you're saying, you need to confront them on that. You got to go meta and say, look, we're not going to be able to work together in a positive way if I ask you a question and you never answer it. Right? Like whatever it is, if your client's asleep, you need to confront. That's required. That's a required confrontation. If the client's malicious, if they're really actively working against you, whether it's active or passive aggressiveness, so to speak, if they really are, working against themselves and the coaching relationship, you got to handle that. Like that's not going to work long term. If you're being nice to your client, which is fine, there's nothing wrong with being nice, okay? But if you're being so nice to your client and your client sees nice as weak, and there are clients that will do that, they'll see you being nice as you being weak. It doesn't mean you're weak. It just means they're going to make that judgment of you. You have to confront them, because if not, then you're just a weak pussy and you can't coach anybody. You can't coach that client because they're going to judge you like that, and they're just going to, they're going to see everything through that lens, through that filter of you're just a weak coach and you're not. Who are you to tell me anything, or who are you to ask me those questions, or who I'm not going to tell you any of this kind of stuff because there's no respect there, right? So those are some situations where confrontation is required, not just a possibility. I'm not in love with confronting clients, but I know when I got to do it. And when you have to, when you know it's absolutely required, you just gotta get off the pot and do it. If the client is being their lower self, if they're lying, if they're being completely immature, if they're being babies, and by the way, a lot of clients, I see that quite a bit. It's like they may not do that in real life, but as soon as they get on the coaching call, they regress into 12 years old, right? If they're just focused only on themselves, being totally selfish or lazy. Now, obviously, there's levels of this that are probably acceptable and you can get by, but these kind of lower self kind of experiences, when somebody brings that into the coaching relationship, you got to confront them, let them know, look, you're lying about that. I just can't let you continue to do that. We got to get this handled. Stop lying and tell me the truth. Or, you know what, like what's the age of the conversation you're having right now? Like, it sounds like you're acting about 6. Confront them. Let them know this is not a mature conversation that they're having, or that not a very mature mindset that they're taking on. Or if again they're seeing you as weak, they're taking advantage of things. Let them know. Look, I'm not just gonna let you do this. I'm not gonna let you off the hook. Sometimes being a coach is just being straight about what is okay and what is not okay as well. So those are times when confrontation is not just an interesting idea, but it's something that is required. So what about the steps towards confrontation? Like, most of the time as a coach, you're probably not just going to confront right up front. Okay, that's not very elegant. That's not the most elegant approach, and it's probably not going to be long-term effective either, even if it affects the client in the short term. So some things to think about before you confront your client. First of all, don't do it in a vacuum. If all you do is confront your client, there's nothing else that you're offering to your client's probably going to feel taken advantage of. They're probably going to feel disrespected. They're possibly gonna feel that you didn't hear them or you don't care. There's all sorts of different problems that occur if you just confront and nothing else. You're just silent and then confront, right? You don't want to do it in a vacuum. Confrontation is like a vitamin, right? You don't live on vitamins. You can't just eat vitamins every day. It's not going to go very well. You have to get all your macros. There's other things you got to eat, right? So confrontation is a part of that complete breakfast. Okay, don't just do it in a vacuum. Also, let's see. Kelly says, "Oh, being your lower self," right? So it's good to just have that on your radar screen. Like, where is my client? Like, what's really going on with them? Sometimes people are their lower self and they don't even realize there's a higher self available, right? It's one thing if they're like aware of it. Like a lot of times I'll work with somebody who's a really smart person. They know better, but they're really being they're in a very lower self mindset, so to speak. So that's an easy conversation to have then. But if somebody's being their lower self and they don't even realize there's a higher level of thinking that they could gravitate towards, rather than confronting them, I probably would just want to introduce them to that first. Like, hey, what if you were to think about this way? Or how could you think about that better? If the answer is I don't know, maybe I actually introduce that to them. That's not very confrontational. Once I introduce it to them and they take it on and I see that it's possible for them, though, them regressing, not really very cool. So you can keep kind of setting a higher standard for your client through introducing mindsets to them, letting them actually step up to that level, and then also making sure you enforce that standard, at least in conversations you have with them, by noticing when they go back to their lower self and saying, look, you were this a couple days ago. Are you going to just go back down and have that be a waste for you? Is that really acceptable for you? Certainly not for me as your coach. So yeah, really, really great point. Okay, so what were we talking about? Okay, the what to do before you confront. So we talked about not doing it in a vacuum. Your relationship with your client is very important. You need to generate a relationship, like somebody on Instagram said a second ago. Rapport is critical. And I'm not going to get into the finer points of generating a great relationship. Most coaches are awesome relationship creators. So, creating a relationship, there is an art to it, but usually as caring coaches, we're pretty good at creating a positive rapport with people. So I'm not going to worry too much about that in this conversation since it's not really about that. But you do want to have that as a foundation. Hey, Gigi, good to see you. You want a relationship as kind of a foundation to that relationship or to that coaching first. There's also the idea of potential power versus active influence in your coaching. So when you get great rapport with your client, when your client's just like, oh, I love that coach, they're so nice, they're so great, we just get along so well, they really get me, they really understand me, that's not power. A lot of coaches think that will make them powerful as coaches. It doesn't necessarily. I mean, it's potential power, but it doesn't guarantee that you have power with that client just because you guys like each other a lot. Liking is a nice foundation, but it doesn't set new standards. It doesn't transform your client necessarily. So think of that like you go to the gas station, you put gas in the tank. That's like being nice. That's creating rapport. That's acknowledging a client. That's really listening deeply. It creates the potential for movement, the potential for progress. Just because you have your car is gassed up, doesn't mean it's going anywhere. Okay, so once your car is gassed up, you gotta fire up the engine, right? You gotta push on the gas. You gotta get the sparks flying, and that's a little bit more of that's a more intense experience than just some car sitting there with gas in the tank. So potential power, relationship and rapport and foundational coaching stuff, that's the gas in the tank. Then you got to actively influence your client. And the active influence sometimes takes the role of confrontation. That's where you're actually getting somewhere. It's really not a good idea to confront if you don't have gas in the tank, if you don't have that relationship foundation. But once you've created it, if you don't confront at some point, your car's not going anywhere. It's just sitting there, and you guys are talking about how nice it would be if someday you took action, or someday you transformed, or you were nice to your husband or wife, or whatever it is, whatever the breakthrough is that they're looking to create, right? That's active influence, when you actually get past that, and sometimes that means confront. So you can acknowledge who your client is, but eventually you got to cash in your chips. Sorry, this wants to bend over again. Eventually you got to cash in those chips, and you got to do something with that influence, and that's not always going to be so pretty. Let's see. Oh, okay, so I can actually move this now. So the key to driving your client forward, to actually making that progress while maintaining a great relationship. This is the trick, and in fact, this is that coach that I was working with last week, where she was having trouble confronting her client. This is what she asked. She asked, how can I confront them and still have a great relationship with them? How can I make sure that we are going to ongoingly work together and they're not going to hate me when I confront them? And there's a couple different approaches I would share. The first one is attack and confess. So the attack is the confrontation. That's kind of obvious. It's like there's a certain attack that happens when I say, you know what, you sound like you're being a jerk and you're being a baby, and you need to grow up. And it sounds like what you need to do is start doing this work and stop being lazy. And it looks like you're just not committed to this at this point. So like, You need to get this handled. Like that's the attack, right? That's nobody's gonna like hearing that, right? Or any variation on that. I'm actually gonna share a link to this video for you. I did a video or created a video last month about accountability coaching, and I was working with a client in a session not too long ago, and she was saying that she was scared or something like that, and I said, well, how does that stop you from taking action when you lie about that, when you lie that you're scared? Now, I knew that client well enough to know that that really was a lie, and she kind of laughed it off because we have good rapport. Again, we have that foundation, the gas in the tank, the potential power that I was then cashing in. That was my attack, right? And those kind of things are going to happen, right? You need to be able to attack your client a little bit at times. It's not even attacking them. It's like attacking what they're doing. It's attacking the thing that's getting in the way. In Christian circles, they would say, what is it? Hate the sin, love the sinner, right? It's kind of the same thing. It's like, but however you attack, there's going to be some kind of attack, whether you're super elegant about it or not. So the second part of that, though, is confess. And now this is actually really simple to do. Like if I attacked you and I said, you're being a baby, you're being lazy, when are you going to get this handled? This is not acceptable. In the same breath, then I come back and I confess and I say, you know what? The reason why I can say that, the reason I'm telling you that with that level of intensity is because I've done it like 12 times in my life. I've done it 100 times, over and over and over again. I've been a baby. I've been lazy. I've been stupid about this. And, I had to turn that around or else I never would have gotten the positive changes that I wanted in my life, right? So you're actually confessing that you've been there, right? Or you've done something just as dumb or just as low on the level of consciousness or just as immature, right? It's attack and confess. Super, super simple. And then what my client said, or the coach I was working with at the time, when I asked her this kind of question, she didn't exactly say this, but I asked her this. I said, when you actually confront your client, can you love them while you confront them? Can you love them at the same moment that you confront them? And she said, yeah, I could totally do that. And so I asked her, I was like, what would that create in your client if you were able to do that? And she said, well, it'd have a huge impact, and also we'd have an ongoing relationship as well. By the way, if you're watching this, I think we've got a couple that are watching on Instagram right now. We're about to get shut down on Instagram because we hit our time limit, whatever it is. I think it's like an hour. So feel free to hit up the link in the bio, and that'll take you over to my my YouTube channel. And I'm streaming on YouTube right now. You'll need to subscribe, and then you should be able to access my live stream there. All right. So anyway, those are a couple pieces for how you can do this and what you might want to manage before you actually confront. And then finally, just be flexible. Be ready to be wrong. Be ready for your client to be defensive about this. Ask questions. Just because you say something doesn't mean you'll always have to be right as the coach. You can correct yourself as well. As the coach, I'm not always right. I'm never really right. I'm just going to share things that you can take on or not. So now, how do you do this? How do you actually confront? We just talked about some things to be ready for before you confront. I'm going to share a couple points for how to actually confront. First one is use direct questions. Use very narrowly focused questions. Do you realize you're lying about this? Do you see where you're being immature? Like, how long have you been a jerk? It's like really simple. Like, you don't let them up. You're not just open-ended questions like, tell me about what you feel about that and that kind of stuff. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just when you're confronting, you got to cut the ring off and you're cornering your client to some extent. Second, force your client to answer. That was what was happening with the coach I was working with. Her client was not answering her questions, and she just let it go. It's like, let them know, hey, look, I'm expecting to answer the question that I just asked. You didn't answer it. A lot of times that's what people do in a coaching session. Force them to answer the question. Don't let them off the hook. Don't let them deviate. Keep them on a short leash. If they start going off on a tangent, or talking about something else, or changing the subject, talking about how nice a day it was, stop them. Say, you know what? Like, I need to stop you here because we need to talk about this thing because you need to get it handled because it's really interrupting your progress, or it's going to keep you from what you want. Would you not agree with that? Get them and rein them in a bit. You got to keep them on a little bit of a short leash while you're actually confronting. stop them is basically the point I just shared. Repeat questions, right? Like if they don't answer the question, or if they don't answer it fully and they really need to get farther down the road of actually clearly answering that question with power and truth, repeat the question. Use a dominant tone, right? Like there's a lot of coaches, they're so nice and their tonality is it's so harmonious, it's just so nice and everything's fine, everything's just very positive. And it's like, again, nothing wrong with that, but not when you're confronting. I mean, I guess you could use that tone when you're confronting, but I don't know if it's going to have as much of an impact on certain clients that, again, will see niceness as weakness. Sometimes you need to change your tone, and your tone needs to become more dominant, stronger, more powerful, more rigid maybe. There's different ways you can do that. I'm not going to get into the art of tonality at this point, but definitely tone impacts the intensity of the confrontation and how effective you are in the confrontation as well. Interrogate. Sometimes you just got to interrogate your client because they're not going to engage. They're not going to fully answer the question. You need to, again, narrow down, corner them a bit, and make sure that they get to the answer. Again, doesn't mean that you always know what's going on at that point, but at least make sure that you get to what's real with your client. Okay, final piece today. Because we covered a lot of technique around confrontation. We covered a lot of things to lay as groundwork, when to do it, when not, why you would want to confront, why you might not want to confront. If you've missed any of this, check out the replay. As soon as we're done, we'll I'm sure it'll like do whatever it does so you can see the rest of it later. But some coaches kind of can't confront. And I'm going to talk just for a second about certain personalities, certain behavioral styles, certain thought processes that make it really challenging, if not impossible, for a coach to actually confront their client. So the first one is the behavioral style. Sometimes certain styles of behavior, like a really people-oriented coach, makes it hard to confront because they're so, hey, good to see you, Snipes. They're so worried about rejection. They're so worried about somebody rejecting them or not appreciating them or not connecting with them. Also, more introverted behavioral styles. When you're more on the introverted side of the spectrum, a lot of times it's much more intimidating to confront your client as well. So those are certain approaches to life that could hold a coach back from actually confronting. So if you're in those ballparks, usually what you think is too confrontational, what you think is like too intense or like really in somebody's face, is actually not confrontational enough. It's not intense enough. And you need to be overly intense, overly confrontational, what you think is overly confrontational, in order to just be barely intense enough to actually be getting through to your client. Also, there's certain cognitive biases. Let me see. This is my little axiology cube here, and there's a certain cognitive bias called empathy. Coaches have this in spades. Usually, they have really, really high empathy levels, and which is great. Nothing wrong with having a lot of empathy. But if you have a bias towards empathy in your own cognitive mind, the way your brain thinks about things, and you put people's feelings on a pedestal, you kind of enable people's feelings, so to speak, then that can take you out of the game. That could actually cause you to not confront and not actually transform your clients. One of the worst profiles for a coach that needs to hold their client accountable and needs to confront their clients. Not a good thing. So in fact, I think the coach I was working with a couple weeks ago, that was exactly what the challenge was. It was one of their challenges, is they were just super high empathy, and they had a lot of bias towards having a ton of empathy. So there's a point, I mean, empathy's good, but there's a point where you got to stop playing to and enabling your client's emotions and saying, you know what, I got you afraid, or I got you angry, I got you this, totally empathetic with that, and now it's time to put that in its place, and you got to break past that. Because if you're just sitting there afraid, or if you're just sitting there lazy, or just sitting there scared, you're screwed. And I was like, is that okay for you? Are you okay? This is the rest of your life, the way it's going to be? Is that your standard for life? Is that your standard for yourself and your family and the people that you touch? Like, what do you think the impact is going to be of that, right? And that is when you turn that corner from empathy to confrontation, that's when, like, you're not really being so empathetic at that moment, right? And somebody who has a positive bias towards empathy, it's really challenging to do that, but you've got to get yourself to do it. Once you do it a couple times, it becomes habit, because you'll start seeing people really love you for it. People really appreciate that you actually were courageous enough and cared for them enough to actually confront them. That's the real question you got to ask yourself. Maybe put this on your wall if you're a coach. Do I care enough to confront? Do I care enough about my client to confront them so that it's uncomfortable for me and maybe even uncomfortable for them? Do I care enough to do that? It's a great question to ask, especially if you have a bias towards empathy. Finally, self-esteem. Self-esteem is another factor in a lot of the cognitive tests that we run. We check where somebody's self-esteem is. Other ways to discuss that. Again, we can go down a rabbit hole around that subject. But if, as a coach, or even as a human being, your self-esteem is not super high, that could be a major factor that could prevent you from confronting a client. Because if we don't care enough about our feelings, then we end up feeling lousy. Like I said at the beginning of this conversation, it's like that coach was taking on all of the angst and the frustration, the upsets of their client that their client should have been experiencing within their life at that time. And it's like they didn't have high enough esteem for themselves. They didn't care enough about how they felt to say, I'm not going to let myself feel that way just because you're going through that. You need to get this handled. And in fact, you probably should feel pretty lousy about this if you don't change it, right? That's very different than a low self-esteem response, because you got to have higher self-esteem in order to step up and not let your client hurt the relationship, or even have, cause you to go through, it's really not their fault, but put you in a situation where you're like going through stress or anxiety or suffering because of the way they're living their life, So if that's a feeling you have, it's like, well, I can't do this because, I'm not good enough, or I'm not, I should just kind of suffer through this. It's like you got to get past that and say, you know what, I'm not going to let myself feel that way anymore. I've got to have higher self-esteem. I've got to have higher esteem for myself. I got to care more about my feelings so that I actually stop feeling that way and I go ahead and deal with my client without me feeling bad about it. When I confront somebody, I'm not like angry. I'm not like worried. I'm not nervous. I'm not fearful. I'm not sad. I'm like, this is like, I get to do this. Like, I get to actually confront my client in a way that's going to make a difference for them. I'm really happy about that, right? I'm honored. It's a profound privilege to confront your client, even if it's really in their face. It's a profound privilege. Is it always comfortable for me? No, not necessarily. But just because my client's going through hell doesn't mean I should be going through hell during that session. Okay, so, and I'll tell you, like 10 years ago, I couldn't have said that. I would generally have had to admit that, I would go through hell when my client would go through hell, and I'd cry and I'd worry and I'd go through all those things. And sometimes I still do a little bit, but like more once in a blue moon rather than what happened early on in my coaching career. And I think part of that's just getting more skills, seeing that eventually that doesn't really help my client, and knowing that that's counterproductive. But the other side of that also, I think, to some extent, is just loving myself more and loving myself enough and having high enough self-esteem to say, you know what, my experience in this coaching actually matters to me. It doesn't mean it's the most important thing, because how I feel is not most important when I'm in a coaching session, right? But it's still a factor. What I go through is still a factor, because and it's not even because it's like I'm most important in the coaching session. It's, in a way, you could even say it's because if I'm feeling lousy, I can't really serve. I've got to be in a really great state of mind if I'm going to serve my client. So that really constitutes some of the patterns that coaches will have if they're being a bit wimpy here, like our Diary of a Wimpy Kid graphic or our image shows. So that said, a couple things to follow up with this for a little bit further study that I'm going to share with you before we log off today. First one, and if you have any questions, feel free to pop in the chat right now, and I'm happy to answer, or anything for discussion or any thoughts. But this is the video. I'm going to give you a link to this. This is the video that I published about a month ago around accountability coaching. And if you're in accountability training right now, if you're about to start, check that out. It's a great primer. But also, you'll get a sense of how I confronted that client. Literally a live demo, basically, recording a live demo with some explanation in that video there. So I just popped that into the comments. And also, I know we talked a little bit about kind of Tony's confrontation when it came to the Me Too movement. I actually did a video around working with people who are actually victims of sexual abuse, sexual violence, sexual victimization, and my experience doing that. And not exactly on topic for confrontation, but in a way it is. And so I just wanted to share that with you as well. That link I just popped into the chat as well. If you're watching on YouTube right now, I'll give that to you in a few minutes as soon as we go offline. And then finally, if you are checking this out on Facebook, feel free to pop over to YouTube as well. Subscribe to me there, and you'll get reminders next time I do a live stream like this, and you'll also have access to recordings as well. And then finally, if you're not already a part of our Facebook group, this is a public Facebook group that Become a Paid Life Coach Online that I know some of you are a part of. But if you're not, I do post these recordings on there. So if you miss any of this, you'll get to see the whole thing on there, because I'll share it in just a little while. And you'll see pretty much everything that we do here at Master Coach University as well via that group also. It's a great way to keep in touch. Guys, I will talk to you next time. Have a great rest of your Sunday. And for those that are in accountability immersion training, we start tomorrow, not during the day, Labor Day, but later on in the evening when you're done with all your vacationing. And look forward to a general orientation with y'all, and I'm sure we'll have some fun confrontations at that point. So take care, and I will talk to you then.